Great, thank you, Phil. That end again. Thanks so much for the worship this morning. Kind of felt I was like back in my dad's church as well this morning. Felt like a Baptist all over again. Yeah, don't worry, there's a little part of my heart that's still Baptist. Great, well, yesterday we were thinking about the kind of church God is calling us to be, that maybe God is calling us to be a pilgrim and a priestly and a prophetic church. We thought about some of those themes and how they work together in our particular context today. And today I want to start with a question for you. And my question is this. We spoke about it just a moment ago. What would it take? What would it take for there to be a real revival of faith in Britain today? If you were to say, if there's one thing that the church needs to do to bring about a renewal, a revival, a deepening of Christian faith in our country, what would you say that would be? So just think about that for a moment. Let's have some ideas around the room. If there's one thing you think the church needs to do that might trigger a renewal, a revival of faith in Britain today. You know, we're so used to the kind of figures of decline. What would it take for those figures to start beginning to kind of rise again? Shout out if you got something. Yeah.
Expect God.
Expect God. Brilliant. Thank you. Any others?
Unity.
Unity. Fantastic.
Courage.
Courage.
Hunger for God.
Hunger for God.
Obedience.
Obedience.
Pour out God's love.
Pouring out of God's love. Thank you.
Confidence in the word.
Confidence in the word.
Amen.
Yeah, great.
Prayer for revival.
Prayer for revival.
Submitting to God's word.
Submitting to God's word.
Suffer persecution.
Sorry again?
Suffer persecution.
Suffer persecution. Interesting one there. Yeah, okay, yeah. Often some of the things that lead to something remarkable afterwards. Yeah.
Give away all our money.
Okay.
600 billion.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, good.
Manifestation of God's power.
Manifestation of God's power. Okay. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, lots of really fascinating ideas around there as to what is the one thing the church might do to bring about a renewal of faith. And I want to talk about something that has been, I guess, on my heart for a number of years as to something I think it's not the only thing we need to do, but it's something that we may need to do to bring about that kind of renewal of faith today. Now, we've recently moved house. We moved back to Oxford, where we used to live before, but for the last 7 years, while I was Bishop of Kensington, we lived in Twickenham. And we lived in a house quite near the river. River Thames would flow past our house just about 50 yards away. And quite often we would go for a walk along the river, and it's a lovely place to walk. And I remember walking there with my son-in-law a couple of years ago. And he's a lovely Christian lad, and he and my daughter have three little kids up in North London. And I was talking to him about what it's like being a Christian today. And he works for a management consultancy company in central London, and they go to an Anglican church up in North London. And he said, you know, the issue today, and if you're a Christian in my generation, it's quite hard going. We were talking about how hard it was to be a Christian. We were looking at the river. That day was kind of a wintry day, a bit like today, but the wind was blowing quite hard, and the river was flowing quite fast. Sometimes on days the river's quite calm, but other days it seems to be really flowing quite hard in one particular direction. And as we looked in the river, and there was this duck that was trying desperately to paddle in the opposite direction from the current. And the current was flowing really fast, and the duck was paddling like crazy and just about making a tiny bit of progress. And he said to me, you know, being a Christian today in my generation is a bit like that duck. You have to paddle really hard just to keep standing still. And so many of my friends just give up paddling and get swept down the river. Because so much of the cultural tide is going in the other direction. When you invite someone to church, or you invite them on an alpha course, you're basically inviting them to a life of paddling really, really, really hard. And he said, maybe what we need to do is not so much to encourage people to paddle harder, but to maybe begin to change the direction of the current. Or at least if we can't change the direction of the current, let's create a little bit of few currents within the current, which makes it a little bit easier to swim in the right direction. And as I thought about that image, it helped me think about one of the things that I want to think about today, which is to expand on what I was talking about yesterday, about our need to be a prophetic church. Yesterday we focused, when thinking about being a prophetic church, on some of the prophetic actions that we might be called to enact within our church, actions that speak of the kingdom of God. But what I want to speak about today is what it means to be prophetic in the sense of proclaiming, speaking the gospel today. And it strikes me that this is something we really need to do and need to do better. Number one, because our society needs it. We're aware that there may have been a day when Christian faith was the sort of common framework of most people's way of thinking about the world. We realise that's no longer the case. And the erosion of Christian faith has meant there's nothing else has taken its place. And actually what has happened, I think, is that, if you like, when we have that overarching story of Christian faith, that there was a God who made us, and who made this world, and ultimately our lives came from him, and they will return from him, however our paths go in the meantime, there was that sense that that was what mattered. There was an overarching framework, and therefore our own little perspectives and our political views and our different approaches, they were kind of penultimate, not ultimate. The ultimate story was the story of God. Our lives, our opinions, our politics were sort of penultimate, and they were kind of held, if you like, within that broader framework. What's happened in our culture, I think, is we've taken away that broader framework, that overarching story of God. And therefore, our politics, our views, they're not penultimate, they become ultimate. That's why we're so divided and fractious as a culture, because we invest ultimate value in our own political opinions, our opinions on this issue or that issue. There's no overarching story to hold us together. Instead, we simply have division and polarization. We see that time and time again throughout our societies. And in that, it seems to me that we need a fresh engagement with Christian faith. Now, that doesn't mean a return to Christendom. It doesn't mean a return to the past. We can get quite nostalgic as Christians sometimes, can't we? You know, wasn't it good in the old days when everyone was Christian? Well, the reality was they weren't all Christian. There was a Christian framework, yes, but not everyone was a Christian. We kind of know that. You Baptists know that even more than we do Anglicans sometimes. But this isn't nostalgia. This isn't about let's go back to the good old days. Because the good old days, let's be honest, weren't always that good. We made all kinds of mistakes in Christendom. We made mistakes of racism and the abuse of power, and we didn't look after people in the way that we should have done. We don't want to go back to those days. We want to move on to another day that God is bringing, that may not look like Christendom in the past. It may look like something very different. But a day when Christian faith is heard much more strongly than it is today. So much that is good in our culture derives from our Christian faith. Many of you will have read Tom Holland's book, Dominion. If you haven't read it, you'll have heard of it. A historian sort of trying to discerning how much of our culture is deeply shaped and rooted by our Christian past, whether we know it or not. We kind of swim like fish in Christian seas, whether you're a Christian or whether you aren't. And so there's a need for a kind of fresh engagement with the Christian gospel today. But the second reason why I think we need to do it is because we're not doing it well. I came across a blog recently by an Anglican priest, a man called Peter Owen Jones. And he wrote this, if we can get the next slide up. He said, he's an Anglican, so he's talking in Anglican language, don't worry about that. So he says, parish priests like me operate at the coalface. We baptise, we marry, we bury, we console where we can. This is the work of the Church of England at the micro level, and I guess you could say the same as the Baptist Church as well. But he says, where the church does not have a compelling presence is at the national level, the macro level. It's here that there's been a complete lack of engagement of witness and imagination. Without effective national witness, work at the local parish level has been made much harder. That's why there's a feeling of sort of swimming against the tide, because the national cultural tide seems to be going in another direction. And whatever good things we do at local level, it's much harder when you haven't got that broader cultural narrative that is working in our favour. And across our country, whether it's Baptist churches, Anglican churches, Methodist, whatever, Pentecostal, whatever it may be, we do lots of really good things at local level. All of you are involved in that. All of you know that. Those ministries, big or small, that we do in our local parishes, in our local churches, wherever we're in our local congregations, we're still quite strong at local level. We've got that presence across the country. But where it's missing is that national level of the declaring of Christian faith. I was talking to a friend who'd just come back from the United States. He'd been there for the last 6-7 years. And coming back to the UK, his observation was, he said, well, the thing is, in America, you cannot avoid the Christian voice, for better or worse. Sometimes for worse. It's there. You just cannot avoid it. Every politician kind of has to do religion in America. But he said, coming back here to the UK, you hardly hear the Christian voice at all in public life. And if you really look for it as a Christian, you can find it. You can find some Christian voices, but you very rarely hear that at national level. And so often the church's voice in public discourse is either shrill, kind of loud and angry, and really not very attractive, or it's scattered, occasional Christian voices, the odd article, the odd kind of voice here and there, but not really well coordinated, or it's silent. You just don't hear it at all. And so I've come to think that one of the things that we may need to give attention to, if we are going to see that renewal of faith, is that renewal of public engagement of the Christian gospel at that public national level, not just at the local level, because the two are related. That local ministry is going to be an awful lot easier to do, if you like, if we get some of that national level right. Now, thinking about this, I want to go back a little bit in history. Think about times when we did this well as the Christian church. And I want to start with the early church. We all know the story of how the early church grew from 11 frightened disciples after the crucifixion, thinking that their movement was about to be snuffed out like that because Jesus was dead. And we know how that movement not only had that spark of renewal with the resurrection and the coming of the Holy Spirit, but began to spread, and by 4th and 5th centuries became the kind of dominant religion of the Roman Empire, defeating the great, if you like, or outlasting the Roman Empire. And paganism, which was that sort of system of religion at the time, dwindled almost to nothing. It's never quite gone away, still with us in many ways, but Christian faith grew hugely over that period. So how did it happen? What were the ingredients of that Christian growth over the first few centuries of the Christian church? Well, there are a number of elements to it. First, you might talk about the miracle workers. Many of the stories of conversion that you read from the early church tell stories of the impact of Christian miracles, of preachers and others who went around praying for the sick and praying for miraculous things, and they apparently seemed to happen. You even had characters in the early church called Gregory Thaumaturgus, which means Gregory the wonder worker. That'd be good. Any fancy that title for your Baptist minister? John the wonder worker, Basildon. I don't know what's Basildon out there, but there we go. But there are a lot of stories. There's something about the kind of miraculous that was there within the early church that couldn't help but grab people's attention. There was a whole strand of scholarly work on the early church. If you read a historian called Ramsay MacMullen, that's basically his argument that why the early church grew is basically because of the stories of miracles. People were impressed by these amazing miracles. Some of them are really outlandish, but something's going on there, and that kind of provoked people into faith. The second element of what brought about the growth church, and we mentioned it a little while ago talking about persecution, was the martyrs. Those who gave up their lives for the sake of Christ. Those who felt actually their faith in Christ was more important even than life itself. That could not help impress people in that Greco-Roman world. Here were people for whom this was so, so important that even life itself was not valuable. Now that again could not help make people think. If you see someone who is so attached to a cause that they would even give their life for it, that just makes you think. And again, that link between persecution and growth, we mentioned it just a moment ago, is very strong, particularly in the early church. Many, again, of the accounts of conversion we have in the early church are those impressed by stories of persecution. The third ingredient, perhaps, to that growth was the monks. We know that movement that began with St. Anthony in the middle of the 2nd century, going out into the desert to live a life utterly devoted to God, a life of prayer, the reading of Scripture, devotion to God, to seeking God's face every single moment of every day, and the kind of rich, intense holiness that grew within that moment. Not just St. Anthony, beyond him. St. Anthony was the kind of leader of the kind of eremitical, kind of almost the kind of individual monk on their own. And you get Pachomius leading a whole kind of movement of monastic communities of people living together. His life of prayer and devotion, the reading of Scripture, the manual work, this devotion to God. And again, so many of the stories of the early church refer to those as well. You may remember the story of Augustine when he was converted. He's converted while he is reading Athanasius' biography of St. Anthony. St. Athanasius, the great early Christian theologian, wrote a biography of St. Anthony, one of the first great monks of the early church. And he's reading that story of how Anthony separated himself from the world to devote himself utterly to God, that Augustine was just so impressed by that it really made him think, and it was that one of the things that sparked off his kind of the beginning of his faith. So the miracle workers, the martyrs, the monks, those were perhaps some of the ingredients of that growth of the early church. You might want to do an exercise of thinking, well, where are the miracle workers, the martyrs, and the monks? Is that what God is calling us to today? But there's a fourth element that I want to draw attention to, and that is also, this one doesn't begin with M, by the way. And these were the early Christian apologists. These were figures who took seriously the intellectual, spiritual task of declaring the gospel in public. And they weren't in opposition to the miracle workers or the martyrs or the monks, but they kind of built upon what they did. So you have figures like, go to the next slide, we get figures like Justin Martyr, this young sort of searcher for truth who meets a man on a beach in Ephesus while he is searching for truth in Platonism of his day, and the man points him, have a long conversation, and points him towards the Old Testament prophecies, and points him in the direction of Jesus, and he becomes a Christian. And he then begins to write these apologies, these letters, defending the Christians who are being persecuted by the Roman Empire. As his name suggests, Martyr is not his surname, by the way. He was one of those who gave his life for Christ, Justin Martyr. You get figures like Origen. Origen, this slightly strange, quite brilliant man. His theology is always a little bit on the edge of, is it really orthodox or not at times? But he was a brilliant apologist. There was a man called Celsus who wrote a kind of rigorous attack on Christianity. And Origen writes this long and quite brilliant book called Contra Celsum, against Celsum, where he goes point by point, all the points that Celsus makes against Christian faith. He shows how empty his arguments are, and how instead he mounts a kind of strong defense of Christian faith, not just a defense of Christian faith, but a promotion of Christian faith. You get St. Augustine, who writes, as we talked about yesterday, The City of God, which is really a kind of work of Christian public witness. It's trying to show how paganism just does not give you a satisfying way of living and dying, but Christianity does. That's effectively what the whole point of The City of God is about. It's a very long book if you read it. It's good as a doorstop, but basically what it is. It's a long argument showing how paganism just doesn't work and Christianity does. And the confluence of those things, the miracle workers, the martyrs, the monks, and the apologists, this public demonstration, this public articulation of Christian faith in public, along with the others, led to the growth of the church during that period. Now that's one example of the early church. Just bringing that up to date, another period that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, where I think we did this well, probably the last time we did this well, was Britain in the 1940s. Now, in the early 1940s, during those years of the Second World War, there was a big debate that went on in Britain, and in fact across Europe, which was basically along these lines. It was saying, like, okay, we are right in the middle of this terrible war, but one day it will be over. One day we hope Nazism will be defeated, but what is going to rebuild Western civilization after the war? People were aware in the 1940s. They'd been through the First World War already. They'd arrived at a settlement which hadn't worked, and then it had led to the Second World War. And there was a kind of feeling, well, how come the great civilization of the West has landed in this place where we are tearing ourselves apart with this evil cancer at the heart of Nazism? How come that has happened? And what's going to rebuild civilization after the Second World War? And as that debate went on during those war years, Christians were right at the heart of that debate. And there were a number of Christians who, sometimes together, sometimes apart, they didn't always get on with each other, but they were a kind of sort of movement of people, articulated a rich Christian vision of the world in public. And so you had C.S. Lewis, there he is on the left, you'll recognize him, giving his broadcast talks. He gave a series of talks on the radio between 1941 and 1944 during the war years. And he eventually wrote up those broadcast talks into what became Mere Christianity, which was published in the early 1950s. And they were quite remarkable in a way because, Oxford professors didn't give talks on the radio in those days. He was kind of appealing for a more popular audience. Didn't make him popular back in Oxford, but they got huge sort of coverage. You had Dorothy Sayers, there she is. Dorothy Sayers, this sort of journalist, novelist, who wrote plays. She wrote The Man Born to be King, a play about the life of Jesus. Again, were performed on the radio, and people would listen in to hear them that were there. And she wrote again some very kind of pungent, quite sharp articles about Christian faith and Christian orthodoxy and how that is the only way that really gives you a path to live. You had the great poet W.H. Auden. Think about him a little bit later on. W.H. Auden is again a really very interesting figure. In 1941, W.H. Auden he was living in America, and he went to the cinema one day, went to watch a film. And in the newsreel before the film, because in those days no TV, so you had the news went on before the cinema. I'm not that old to remember it, by the way. Just apparently that's what they tell me. And he saw the newsreel, and there was a kind of a news item about Germany, and there was a news item about Polish people. And he was in a part of New York who had a lot of Germans living in it. And he was quite shocked when the Germans around him, looking at the Polish people on the screen, started shouting, "Kill them, kill them, kill them." And he was just astonished. How come in the middle of New York, this sophisticated city, here are Germans who, of course, had become sort of enamored with the Nazi party, who were calling for the killing of Polish people. And it really made him think. And he began to think, well, what grounds have I got for saying that that's wrong? Anyway, to cut a long story short, he only began to realise eventually that only it was when he realised that the threat of Nazism could only be resisted by an equally powerful or even stronger universal and opposite ethic. And the only way he could find that was Christian faith. And so he became a Christian because he believed that Christian faith was the only thing that had the spiritual, moral, intellectual power to confront the evil of Nazism. And he began to write Christian poetry, like a very long kind of verse poem called For the Time Being, Christmas Oratorio, from 1941 to 1942. You had T.S. Eliot, the great poet at that time who, back in 1922, had written The Wasteland, this rather bleak, grim depiction of life kind of after the First World War. And we sort of just remembered it. It was 100 years ago last year when that was written, published. But in the 1936 to 1942, he writes the Four Quartets, which is this deeply Christian vision of the world, much more hopeful. Long, elaborate poem drawing on all kinds of themes, but a rich Christian vision of the world. You get figures in France like Simone Weil, this very strange, mystical sort of, was she Christian, was she not? She was kind of attracted to Christ, it's hard to kind of know. And you get Evelyn Waugh writing the novel Brideshead Revisited. You may know of that, which he describes. He was published in 1945, and he describes the theme of it is about the operation of divine grace on a group of diverse but closely connected characters. You get J.R.R. Tolkien beginning to dream up what became The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which again has deeply Christian roots in its story. You had political thinkers. You had people like William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, with his Christian social vision, which in part gave birth to the welfare state. After the Second World War, you have people like Reinhold Niebuhr and others with their political vision of the world. So in other words, during this period of the early 1940s, you had this kind of movement of Christians who were articulating a rich, imaginative vision of the world and declaring it in public. Now, the really interesting thing I think about this, and this is an unproven theory, but it's my little theory, whatever it is. So, if you look at the kind of figures of church decline over the past 150 years, basically it kind of goes from the middle of the 19th century, it kind of goes down like that, apart from one little period. And that's the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, but there's a little upturn. And you get to the end of the 1940s and the 1950s, you get this little upward turn. And whether you look at Sunday school enrollment, baptisms, confirmations, church attendance, it's the biggest upturn of growth since the 18th century happens at that period. Now, people struggle to work out what on earth caused this. Was it the Billy Graham thing? Well, Billy Graham comes a little bit too late, because he comes in 1954 to 1956, and the turn happens before that. And I guess my theory is that what these Christian thinkers and playwrights and poets and others did was they kind of articulated this rich Christian vision of the world that made Christian faith attractive. It made it visible. It made it compelling for people. And so that when the war was over and people were looking around for something that would rebuild their lives, rebuild their communities, it was Christian faith they turned to. Christian faith suddenly became credible because of that public witness at that time. And in a way, Billy Graham basically harvested the fruit of that earlier work, because that Greater London Crusade that he had in 1954 reaped the harvest of that rich, imaginative vision. Now, it didn't last. The 1960s came along, and the vision was not renewed. That kind of imaginative depiction of Christian faith wasn't really renewed after that. And also Christians didn't really come up with very strong answers to the kind of challenges to Christian faith and morality in the 1960s and the growth of the technological society as well. But it's illustrative just to go back and think, maybe that could happen again. Now, what do we learn from that? Well, the first thing, just a simple thing, is that in moments of crisis, the church either grows or declines. It kind of goes that way or that way. Doesn't usually stay the same. Yesterday we were talking about a decade of disruption and the upheavals that we've been through in recent years, particularly the COVID pandemic. And the question is, what will happen to the church? Will it go like that? Or will it go like that? The church grows or declines in moments of crisis. 1940s was a moment of crisis, and as a result the church seemed to grow for a short while. What will happen as a result of COVID? The jury's still out on that. We're still too early to tell. But secondly, maybe we need a new kind of apologia, a new kind of public witness. That word apologia is a good New Testament word. We read it again and again. And we think of that in terms of the language of what we call apologetics. And my sense is that we maybe need a new kind of apologetics for today. When you think of that word apologetics, the problem with it is that, when you use it to people outside the church, it sounds like we're just apologising for being Christian. I'm really sorry. Don't really mean it, but I'm a Christian. When you use it inside the church, people tend to think it means building all kinds of arguments why you should believe that God exists. Or all kinds of arguments as to why Richard Dawkins is wrong. And we think of apologetics as, public debates with Christian over against atheist, hammering it out and trying to win the argument and hoping at the end of the day more people vote for Christians than for the atheists. And we think that's kind of what apologetics is about. And it seems to me that our kind of public witness, our public apologetics has gone down that rabbit hole where the terms are set really by the new atheists, not by the gospel. We're on the back foot all the time, trying to kind of prove that God exists after all. Or that the resurrection happened, or that Jesus really did exist and is the Son of God, and so on. And it's interesting that there was that whole movement of the new atheism, where we thought, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and all those kind of people. And in some ways, that's kind of moved on now. When you think about it, with the new centre that I'm setting up, and I'll say a bit more about it in a moment, we've been doing a bit of research. There are not that many real hard atheists anymore. There are still people kind of, drawn in by the Richard Dawkins kind of line. But many people, including atheists or agnostics, are rather turned off by that very hard-line atheism. And in fact, many figures like Alan Zabotoi, a philosopher who's an atheist, has recognised the usefulness of religion. Religion isn't totally bad, like Dawkins thinks, but actually it's got some good things. Religions are quite good at building community and bringing people together, motivating people. So they're trying to find out, can we find atheism to do that as well? They're struggling a bit to make that work, but they're going to see the value that atheism brings. Of course, we all know that arguments, however much you come up with a sophisticated argument as to why God exists, it never tends to convince people that much. I don't know how many of you became Christians because you believed the ontological argument for the existence of God. I doubt whether many of us did that. In any case, just in defence of the ontological argument, which goes back to Anselm and Aquinas and so on, it was never intended as a proof to convince people to become Christians. It was always intended as something to help confirm the faith that you already have, that you are not being stupid in believing in God. And so often our apologetics, where we try to appeal to people through rational arguments, sometimes is kind of based on the idea that we share some kind of common rationality that is neutral, that is separate from the gospel. And as one scholar has put it, it can end up with the attempt to commend the gospel in terms that have nothing to do with the gospel itself. Because the reality is that most of us came to faith not through rational arguments, but through things like an answer to prayer, or seeing a healing happen, or a sense of peace that you found when you came to church one day. It's not always at that level. Some people, yes, maybe that's what brought them to faith, but many people it's something richer, deeper than that. Now let me give you a couple of examples of the kind of public witness I think we kind of need today. One is the figure I spoke about a little while ago, W.H. Auden, who was a poet laureate for a while. And after he became a Christian, after having this kind of rather shaken experience in the cinema in New York, he writes this very long kind of verse poem called "For the Time Being." It's a kind of depiction of the Christmas story, from before and after the Christmas story. It's a kind of long verse poem, which were quite popular at the time. And in that poem, he writes this. He says, "We who must die demand a miracle. How could the eternal do a temporal act, the infinite become a finite fact? nothing can save us that is possible. We who must die demand a miracle. Now, I think it's quite interesting. We who must die. There's a kind of recognition there that that is what we are as human beings. We are people who will one day die. It's the one thing that's true about every single human being on the planet. The one thing we have in common, not just one thing, but one thing we do have in common, is that we will all die. We who must die. What is going to overcome death? What is going to overcome evil? What is going to overcome sin? Human ingenuity can't do it. Now, he knew this. This is writing in the middle of the Second World War. Well, they were very aware that human ingenuity had only got them to the atomic bomb, and it had got them Nazism. We who must die demand a miracle. Something has got to come from outside to help us. How can the eternal God do a temporal act, enter into time? Nothing can save us as possible. We need something else, something beyond to enter in. We who must die demand a miracle. He goes on then to talk about this miracle, which is the coming of Jesus Christ. We go on to the next slide for a moment. He says, by the event of this birth, the birth of Jesus, the true significance of all other events is defined. So in other words, you understand everything else in the light of this particular birth. You can only really understand every other human life in the light of this human life. Jesus. You only understand the significance of another person, or of society, or of law, or of economics, or politics, anything in the light of the coming of Jesus Christ, because that is the central fact of history that sheds light on everything else. He goes on, by the existence of this child, the proper value of all other existences is given. For every other creature, it can be said that it has extrinsic importance, but of this child, it is the case that he is in no sense a symbol. Everything else is a symbol that points to something else. What does it point to? It points to Jesus. Everything else points to Jesus, he says. And so here what we find in Auden, have we got one more slide? So one more? Let's go back at the answer. So what he's saying here is he's not mounting a rational argument as to why you should believe in God. He's just announcing something. He's saying the miracle has happened. God has come into the world. If we got it, if we just go on a bit, I think we've got another slide. Just go on a bit. We got one more? No, we haven't. Don't worry. There's another thing which where he says the miracle has happened. God has been born. Nothing else matters. It's a dramatic statement. In one sense, he could have said, God has been born, therefore everything matters. But I guess what he's trying to say is that at the end of the day, that's what matters. In the light of the coming of Jesus, you understand everything else. And therefore, the kind of public witness we need today is, if you like, and that is our task, I think, as ministers, as people speaking the gospel to our congregations and to our wider world, is to kind of show how does everything look in the light of the coming of Jesus. Go on to the next slide, which is Walter Brueggemann, who, Old Testament theologian, who writes this. Says, the teller of the evangel has as his or her work the complete and radical redescription of all of reality. It's to invite and empower and equip the community to reimagine the world as though Yahweh were a key and decisive player. My suggestion is that the genre of testimony, as a bid for assent, rather than proclamation, the assumption of universal consensus, is how ancient Israel proceeded to claim truth in a like situation. Now, his point is that our primary task is not to convince people, it's not to argue people into faith, it's not to come up with the cleverest reasons we can possibly think as to why we're right and the atheists are wrong, but it is simply to bear witness. To say Jesus has come into the world. And we point to that, but we point to everything else in the light of that. We try to describe what does the world look like when it's lit up by the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. What does law and economics and politics and history and housing and architecture and community and race, what does everything look like in the light of the coming of Jesus Jesus Christ, because that is the central fact of history. You and I know that. Other people don't know that, but we know it. And our task is to re-describe the whole of reality. What does everything look like in the light of the coming of Christ? And my second little example of the kind of apologetics is the great 17th century apologist Blaise Pascal. I'm writing a biography of him at the moment, spending quite a lot of time thinking about this extraordinary man. He was a complete genius. He died at the age of 39. So if you're over 40, you've like me, you've kind of underachieved compared to Blaise Pascal. He was one of the greatest mathematicians and scientists of his day. Did groundbreaking experiments on all kinds of mathematical and sort of physical phenomena. He was he also invented buses. Do you know that? Pascal invented buses. He had this idea towards the end of his life that poor people in Paris who couldn't get from the place where they were living to the place where they were working, and as the city was growing, that if he brought up a whole lot of carriages and arranged it so that you could pay 5 sols, which is called, and a tiny bit of money, and it would take you from one place to another. The bus. So next time you go on a bus, remember Blaise Pascal. Anyway, extraordinary man, genius. But he had this powerful experience. He was always kind of a Christian, attracted to a kind of movement within 17th century Catholicism called Jansenism, which was a kind of like a Puritan movement within the Catholic Church, but really a little bit distant from it. And then in 1654, he has this powerful experience of the presence of God, which he described in a kind of poem that he wrote called the Nuit de Feu, the Night of Fire. And he never showed this poem. He wrote it on a bit of paper and he sewed it into his jacket. And whenever he got a new jacket, he would take it out and sew it into the new one again. They only found it when he died. When he died, again, age 39, they cut open his coat. And they thought, there's something in there. They opened it up and out came this little poem that described the night of fire. It's just an account of this extraordinary experience of the presence and power of God. And that kind of catapulted him into a much richer, deeper, more intense Christian faith. And as a result of that, he began to write. He began to think, and he knew all. He had a lot of really sophisticated friends who were all into gambling. And he was the kind of geeky kid who was good at maths, where the gamblers would go to him and say, I've got these bets. Do you think the odds are pretty good on this? And he would work out the odds and trying to work out whether they would be right. So they quite liked him, even though he was a bit of a geek. But he then started thinking, well, how would I commend the Christian faith to these sophisticated despisers of religion, to use the phrase of Friedrich Schleiermacher later on? How would I commend the gospel to these people who've got no time for religion? They're sophisticated, thoughtful, gambling, they love the high life, they love playing games and distracting themselves. How would I do this? And the pensée was this, he started writing notes towards this great apology for the Christian religion that he was going to write. And he would scribble down notes. Some of them were 1 line long, some of them were slightly longer essays. And he kept them in his room. And one day, presumably, he was going to write them up into a whole great apology, but he never got there. He died before he was able to finish it. And so when he died, they found all these piles of notes, piles of paper in his room, and they published them as the thoughts of Monsieur Pascal on religion and various other subjects, or as it's usually known, the pensée of Pascal. And it's an extraordinary work. It takes you a long time to read it, because every now and again you read one and you think, it just makes you stop and think, oh gosh, I've got to think about that for a while. So this very fragmentary text, but it's one of the greatest works of Christian apologetics that's ever been written. And Pascal, in this book, as far as you can tell what he's trying to do, he understands 3 really important things about the way we commend the gospel in public. The first is, people only believe what they want to believe. We think we are rational beings who make up our minds by intellectual processes, but the reality is that we're not like that. Our hearts are much stronger than our heads. I am very good at believing that extra biscuit is not going to do me any harm whatsoever. I can convince myself that that's the case, even though actually rationally it's not true at all. Desire is more influential than reason. That's the way we are made. It's not the way we're made as human beings, as fallen human beings. That's what we are. Desires overcome our reason. That's what Augustine taught many, many years And so he says this, he says, men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. Therefore, he says, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. No point in showing that it's true before you've made it attractive and making people wish it was true. The task of public witness is making Christian faith so attractive that people wish it was true. Then it's not hard to show that it has some sense. It makes sense. That's kind of what C.S. Lewis in the Narnia stories and Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. It's what W. Jordan was doing in his poetry. It's what Dorothy Sayers was doing. They were kind of painting a picture of Christian faith that kind of made people want it to be true. So he understood that people believe only what they want to believe. But secondly, he understood that we have to tell a story that explains more than any other story does. Pascal was in an era where there were kind of two schools of thought at the time. One was dominated by the figure René Descartes, the great philosopher at the time. They were contemporaries. Descartes was slightly older than Pascal. They met, I think, twice, didn't get on very well. But on the one hand, you had Descartes, the kind of rationalist. You can argue your way through your reason to knowing everything about the world. Kind of a little bit like the kind of Dawkins, line of thinking that we know. But on the other hand, there was the figure of, which was from the century before, this Michael Bichat de Montaigne, who was a great kind of example of the skeptical tradition. Well, we don't know anything. We know nothing. There is no such thing as truth. We just got to make our way through life, bumble along, just get there somehow. And that's kind of a bit like the kind of more sort of postmodern mindset that we are aware of in our own day, that realizes that says that there is no such thing as ultimate truth. We are making up our own stories as we go along. It's our own individual stories that matter, not any overarching thing. So Pascal finds himself between these two things: dogmatism, skepticism, overconfidence, lack of confidence in human reason. He talks about how as human beings, we have this immense, incredible capacity for compassion, for love, for creativity, for technology. We are extraordinary as human beings. But on the other hand, we have this equally extraordinary capacity for cruelty and harm, and terror and damage. What explains this extreme that we are as human beings? Our greatness and our misery, our grandeur and our misère. How do you explain that? You're like Descartes and the rationalists. They know all about the greatness of humanity, the greatness of human thought and reason. Montaigne and the skeptical tradition, they know all about our weakness and our frailty and our lack of ability to know anything. But what explains both? And he comes and he says, well, Christian faith explains both of those things because it says that we are both created in the image of God and therefore magnificent, great creatures created for extraordinary things. And yet we are also fallen. And that explains our frailty, our weakness, our cruelty, and so on. And that story explains much bigger than any of the other stories do. And then he goes on. And so he goes on, and he talks about how actually the problem with the kind of normal apologetics is it leads you to the wrong God. In this poem, The Night of Fire, what he discovers is not the God of the philosophers, but instead the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and the learned. We lead people to an encounter with God. And so, just drawing this to a close before we go for our coffee. Now, should we go on to the next little slide for a moment? What do we learn? The church grows or declines in moments of crisis. Which way are we going to go? We need a new kind of public witness, a new kind of apologia. But then lastly, the imagination matters. If we are going to make Christian faith attractive, make it the kind of thing that people wish were true, it's not going to be just by doing it on a rational basis. It's going to be an imaginative retelling of the story. Strikes me that those figures we talked about earlier on in the 1940s, not many of them were philosophers, not many of them were theologians. They were poets, they were novelists, they were artists, they were playwrights. They appealed to the imagination. imagination. They told stories. And they used the technology of their time. At the time, the technology was the radio. There wasn't TV in the 1940s. Pretty well, most people had radios. That's what they used. That's the means by which this stuff spread, not largely through books, largely through the radio. And so, just drawing this to a close, just we go on to the next slide for a moment. Just to leave you with this image. Where I used to work at St Mellitus in London, we've got this picture on the wall. It's a picture by the Christian artist Roger Wagner. And he tends to paint biblical scenes in contemporary life. So it's a picture, it's called Ruth and Boaz. And you can see the figures in the middle there. That's Ruth and Boaz just talking to each other in the middle of the field, the biblical story of Ruth and Boaz. In fact, when you look at the story, it's actually Roger and his wife, the pictures. And so it's a Bedouin tent aside, so it sort of feels Old Testament, it sort of feels contemporary, it feels old, it feels like ancient and Old Testament. But you also got a couple of oil drums here, and you've got a tyre down the bottom, and if you look closely, there are telephone wires that are going across the scene. It's sort of contemporary, but it's old. It's a fusion of the Old Testament story in the present day, bringing it into the present. But the other thing about this picture is the light and the colour. It's a kind of unworldly colour. Cornfields and mountains and skies don't normally look like that. It's lit up by a light that you cannot see. So there's no sun anywhere. You almost can't see where the light is coming from, but it brings out the colours of the scene. And I've heard Roger, the artist, talking about this, and he says what he's trying to do is to describe the world, both the world of the Bible and the world of today, lit up by a strange light. That doesn't come from the sun. You just can't explain it by some physical, scientific means, but it's lit up by something extraordinary. The light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And that, I think, is our task. How do we describe this world as lit up by the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ? Now, I'm going to stop there for a moment because I want to talk a little bit after coffee about the new venture that I'm starting out on at the moment, and we'll have lots of time just to talk about 15 minutes, but it'll give us quite a lot of time for discussion after that as well. And so I'm conscious we've got a bit of time, so we'll be on for coffee a bit longer. Is that right, Phil?
Yeah, shall we come back at 20 past?
Okay, so break for coffee, and we're back at 20 past for the second half. Okay, so we've. So I think I've got an hour for this little session, which is mostly going to be some time for discussion, questions, and so on. But I just want to give a little bit of introduction now, because I'll go back to what I was saying this morning, trying to kind of open up this whole area of public witness and how we do it. As you probably guess, this has been sort of on my mind for a number of years. I've always been interested in the whole question of how the church comes over in public, how we make the case for Christian faith in public life, and been dissatisfied with some of the ways we've done it in the past. And one of the things that happens to you when you become a bishop is you suddenly realise you've got a voice in public. I would say things, put things on my blog, and no one would take any notice before. Suddenly when you're a bishop, they start listening to you, and it's slightly scary when you say things that you probably shouldn't have said. In my story, I became Bishop of Kensington in 2015. In 2017, the Grenfell Tower fire happened. I was there on the day and got very involved in the kind of immediate church response and the community going on beyond that, and found myself in the middle of one of these 24/7 global media storms, for a few days after that. And every time the anniversary comes up, you're called on to speak about it in public. And I found myself thinking, okay, how do I speak as a Christian leader in that context, rather than just saying the same thing as every other community leader says? How do I say something? If I've got my 2 minutes on Radio 4, what do I say that is distinctly Christian and that is different from what others are saying? And so that got me thinking around this. And a couple of years ago, the Church of England did a we did an exercise, what's our vision for the next 10 years, and I remember reading through the documents that came out of that, thinking there's lots of good things here on the mixed ecology of church, and seeking to be humbler and bolder and simpler, and all these kind of things. But when I read it through, I thought, there's nothing there really about the kind of public witness of the church. Back to that issue of local ministry is much harder when you haven't got the broader change of the cultural narrative. So I wrote a paper on this, sent it around to various people, including both archbishops and others, got quite an enthusiastic response back. And then, of course, when you identify a problem, usually what they say is, well, what are you going to do about it? I've got to think about this though. Anyway, came up with the idea, well, what if we had something that was focused, a kind of new initiative, that was focused upon the church's public voice, not just the Anglican Church's public voice. This is not about the Church of England. This is about Christian faith, Christianity more generally within the UK and beyond. On this title, Cultural Witness, again, slightly avoiding the language of apologetics for the reason I was talking about earlier on. But thinking about cultural witness, if what I was saying earlier on was that our primary task is not convincing people, not mounting arguments, but it's bearing witness. Pointing to Jesus Christ, bearing witness within the particular culture in which God has placed us. We find ourselves in the middle of London, England, the United Kingdom, this world, this particular cultural moment. How do we bear witness to Jesus in this moment? So, not ignoring the cultural context, not seeking to mount arguments, and so in this centre we're not going to be having debates between atheists and Christians and that kind of antagonistic, let's argue everybody else into submission approach. But how do you bear witness to the liberating gospel of Jesus Christ in a way that that shows, a bit like Augustine did in The City of God, showing how paganism just doesn't work. It just doesn't help you live well. It doesn't help you die well. Christian faith did that. How do we do the same in our culture, showing how Christian faith is a rich, imaginative picture of Christian faith that enables us to live and die well within the world that God has placed us. And so, the idea emerged of this thing called the Centre for Cultural Witness. We can go on to the next slide, Remote. Alistair McGrath captured it quite well, I think, in highlighting these 3 points as to what I think cultural witness is about. Number one, engaging wider cultural concerns and questions about religious belief. Many people have questions about Christian faith. They've got misunderstandings, perceptions, some right, some wrong. But it's engaging some of those cultural concerns that people have about Christian faith and trying to give something of a response to that. Secondly, displaying the intelligibility of Christianity and its capacity to engage the realities of human experience. So not just defensively showing why what we say makes sense, but how Christian faith makes much more sense of people's experience than any other way of thinking or living. It's a bit like what Pascal was trying to do, making sense of the extraordinary contradiction that human beings are, with this great capacity for creativity and love, technology and brilliance, but also of evil and darkness and sin and everything else. And then the last one, raising questions about the cultural alternatives, which is what Augustine was doing about paganism in The City of God. So actually the other cultural alternatives are out at the moment. Do not give you a satisfying way of living. Do not give you a satisfying way. They cannot build community. They cannot build the kind of life that so much of what we inherit and assume actually comes from our Christian faith. So that's the kind of broad structure of it. And so anyway, when I started to kind of sketch out what this thing would do, we, again, cut a long story short, identified 3 broad aims, things that we would try to do. Communication, learning and training, and research. And it was also intended to be both ecumenical and international. As I say, this was never really just about the Church of England. This is something that is trying to embrace a wide range of Christian voices, committed to that generous orthodoxy which we all share as Christians across the world. And also international as well. I mean, predominantly English speaking, I guess, because that's the kind of language we operate in, but something that is broader than just the UK, even though it's posted. So the way we talk about it is it's hosted and based within the Church of England, but much broader than that. In fact, what happened was when I Started coming up with the idea. I talked to Archbishop Justin about it at one point, and he was very enthusiastic about it. Saying, "This is exactly what we need to do. Why don't you base it here at Mammoth Palace?" And to be honest, I was slightly in two minds about that because I didn't want it to be too institutional and too Church of England. That's the Baptist in me speaking again. But at the same time, there was something about Lambeth Palace. You invite someone to Lambeth Palace, and they come. There's a brand new, brilliant building there, the new Lambeth Palace Library, which was the place we were invited to kind of base the centre in, which is a fantastic space. And so the pluses really outweighed the minuses. And so, and also we're just across the way from the Houses of Parliament as well. So just to go into those three areas a little bit closer. The first one is communication. And the aim here is how do we actually communicate? Not just talk about communication, but communicate with the world outside the church. And so the thing we're spending a lot of our time on, basically I moved over from my job as Bishop of Kensington at the beginning of September to head up this new Centre for Cultural Witness. And the first thing we're working hard on at the moment is setting up this new opinion website, which we've got on the next slide. It's going to be called Seen and Unseen. SeenandUnseen.com. It'll probably launch in early March. It's from that line in the Creed, we talk about God as the maker of all things, seen and unseen. We're interested in the seen, the things that everybody sees, science, law, economics, politics, all those things that we're all aware of. But we're also interested in the unseen realities that make sense of the seen. Because God is the maker of all things, seen and unseen. So that's the kind of idea behind the title. So this is a website which is, so if you think of something like The Spectator or New Statesman or Unheard or those sort of opinion websites, this is not a repository for long, complicated theological pieces written for other theologians to read. This is new material, 2 or 3 articles coming out every day, 10 dozen articles a week, 500 over the year, so a constant stream of material. With this 4 strands to it. So the first strand is called what we call Creed. So this is articles which will explain aspects of Christian faith. There might be articles on Christian doctrines or books of the Bible, or it might be on theologians from the past, or it might be on books that have been particularly influential, or it might be on works of art or architecture, or music or composers who have been influenced by Christian faith. So, for example, in the first, we're kind of building up the first, first kind of appearance of the website, an article there on Thomas Aquinas and his way of thinking about truth and reality, again written by a specialist, but for a kind of audience that is definitely non-theological. And the key editorial value of this website is that everything is written for the person outside the church. There are loads of websites out there for Christians that are basically aiming at a Christian audience. This is not that. We're not the Church Times, we're not Premier Radio, they do a great job in their own right, but we are not writing for a Christian audience. We're writing for an audience outside the church. And one of the things we say to everybody who's writing, every podcast we host, always think of the person outside the church. So, Creed, material that explains Christian faith in some thoughtful, intelligent, but accessible language for the person outside the church. Second strand is what we call culture, which is Christian comment on the big cultural themes of the day, whether that's globalization, whether it's populism, whether it's climate change, whether it's reviews of art exhibitions or films or books or some music coming out or whatever it may be, to comment on culture that's going on around us all the time. Third is what we call comment, which is Christian comment on the issues of the day. So we will be commissioning articles on how do Christians approach the cost of living crisis, or the spat between William and Harry and the royal family, or the immigration crisis, or whatever it might be, just commissioning articles commenting on those issues. If the issue's going to be in the news for more than a week or two, then we'll want to comment on it. And the last strand is sometimes we call character, sometimes we call change, which is really stories of the impact of Christian faith upon individuals and communities, both in the UK and around the world. And that includes stories of Christian persecution, which are often not told in mainstream media. And the idea with these 4 is that, so part of it, this is what Christian faith is. This is how Christians see the world. This is how the world looks differently when you see it through Christian eyes. That's the culture and comment part. This is the difference it makes. These are stories of the impact Christian faith has upon individuals and communities, both in the UK and around the world. So what we're trying to do is, every article, we're going to ask these questions. Does it commend Christian faith? Does it speak positively of Christian faith? Does it address those outside the church, not inside? Does it avoid internal church debate? We don't want to run all kinds of articles on stuff that Christians talk about all the time. We won't be running articles on how to plant a church, or how to run your prayer meeting, or how to deal with a difficult congregation. We're not going to be doing that. There are other people who do that. We're going to avoid, and obviously there are some internal issues that you have to comment on, because they're of interest outside the church, but we're not just going to be Christians arguing with each other as usual. Trying to be intelligent but accessible, speaking charitably towards each other, but also to people outside the church as well. We've got some say we'll attack ideas, but we won't attack people. Trying to be a little bit different from the way that some of these sites work. That's the last one there. So there's the first idea, this magazine website, seenandunseen.com, which will come out first, probably go public sort of in early March. Second is learning, and sorry, just to go back on the communication thing just for a moment. We've done quite a lot of work over the last few months on our audience. Who are we actually trying to reach? We've engaged a kind of marketing company to help us think about the kind of person we're trying to reach. And I suppose when you define it, and you kind of go down to the kind of, the real heart of the target, it's probably someone in their, maybe their early 30s, reasonably well educated, they maybe a graduate, maybe not, but they think about life, they go to opinion websites, they maybe listen to podcasts. They may describe themselves as spiritual but not religious because they think the Christian faith has got nothing much to say to them. It's pretty irrelevant. But they're aware there's more to life than just the material. But they're not the hardline atheists. They're not the paid-up religious. But they are people who are open to the transcendent, open to the reality and possibility of something beyond the material. They probably do mindfulness, they're kind of aware of the spiritual, but they don't think Christian faith has got much to offer them. Now, that's not the only person we're trying to address. You can spread that out, younger and older. People have different views on that, but sometimes it helps to have a kind of in your eye line a particular person you're trying to reach. Second thing is learning. Back to my experience of being a bishop and trying to think, how do I use my voice in public? Because the way people react to Christian faith is often shaped by what they hear public Christians say. And so what we're going to be trying to do in the centre is not so much for the average Christian as to how to share their faith. Again, there are other ministries that do that. But how can we help prominent Christian leaders develop their Christian voice? So people like bishops, people like senior leaders within other churches as well, people like MPs, people in the House of Lords, community leaders, people who are kind of noticed in public, artists, musicians, whatever it might be. How do we help them use their Christian voice better, deepen that Christian voice and strengthen it, provide channels for it, but beyond that as well. It's related to give it to the communication piece. I've spent most of my life actually in academic theology. Before I became a bishop, I was about 25 years in theological teaching. And I've become very aware that most theologians basically write books for other theologians. The average theologian, what do you do when you're going out on a theological career? You do a doctorate, you write a book, you publish it, probably about 25 people buy it and read it. You maybe get a job on the basis of it, and you can live a sort of reasonable life that way. Very little of the work of the theological community ever gets out to the church, let alone to the wider world. And that isn't because there isn't wisdom in that research and that writing, but it's all locked up in 300 or 400 page books that basically no one's ever going to read, unless they are really interested in it. And so part of this is trying to say, how do we help those people, that wisdom, find a voice, connect the world of theology with the church's public witness. And so we're drawing up a long list, we've got about 100 already, of theologians and communicators and others who, and I guess the question we have for theologians is,
have you got a passion for the public witness of the church? You're not just interested in an academic career for its own sake, but you see your role as a theologian as being part of the public witness of the church. Number two, have you got something to say to the world outside the church? So we're not publishing articles that are just of interest to Christians. If there's something in someone's research or a book that comes out that speaks, commends the gospel to the world outside the church, we want to be running that on our website. Number three, can you write in language that ordinary people can understand? Not all theologians can do that. But there are some that can. And we say we've built up a really good list of number of people who kind of satisfy those three criteria. And the idea is that we get to the 300 or 400 page book and we say, right, okay, can you condense that to 1,000 words? Can you put it in language that anyone could understand, who's reasonably intelligent and educated, but has got no Christian background or Christian kind of knowledge? Does it say something that commends Christian faith to the wider culture? And so it's connecting this big world of Christian theology with the public witness of the church, which so often are two separate things. So one of the things we're trying to do is to create these partnerships between public figures like bishops and church leaders and MPs and others with academics. You know, you think of your average MP. I was talking to an MP a little while ago who was saying, Christian MP, who was saying, look, I've just been voted onto the sort of key economic select committee within the House of Commons, and I really want to think about money and the economy as a Christian, but I haven't got time to read all the books on economic theology or the theology of economics. And so part of what we're trying to do is to say, okay, we'll take the MP, we'll find a theologian who's done the work and has written the books and put them in touch with each other. So the MP hasn't got to read the whole book, they can talk to the theologian, create those kind of relationships out of which deepening of the Christian voice will happen in public. We also want to be hosting conversations where we bring together those people with a public voice, with media specialists, with academics, to come again to deepen and strengthen that Christian voice in the public. Third element we're trying to do is what we call research, where we're going to be partnering with university faculties, theological education institutions, on aspects of the church's public witness that we need to think about and work through as a church. So just to give you an example, and this is a bit Anglican, I know, but we've started a project with theologians from Oxford University on the public legitimacy of the Church of England. And what right has the Church of England got to speak on public matters when less than 3% people go to Anglican churches on a Sunday, and if you're being generous, and where, as we now know, less than half the population now think of themselves as Christian? You know, why is, you know, when it comes to the coronation later this year, why is it going to be the Archbishop who puts the crown on the head of King Charles? Why don't we get Judy Dench or David Attenborough or something, National Treasure to do it? A lot of people would say it's much more appropriate. You know, we think much more highly of them than we do the Archbishop of Canterbury. But the reasons for that are deeply built within our sort of constitutional life, our legal life, our cultural life as a nation. So it's a real question around that. So last week, a couple of weeks ago, we held a morning in Lambeth Palace where we brought together MPs, peers, theologians, community leaders to kind of begin to wrestle through those sort of issues. That's going to be feeding into the training of bishops. Because again, when new bishops come on board with the Church of England, we have to help them think about, you've got a public voice now. How do you use it? And we're really open to doing that with the Baptist Church as well, with some senior leaders who have a voice in public too. So we'll be doing other research projects as well, making connections with particular universities around the world. We've got some particular connections with universities here in the UK, but also with some in America. So Miroslav Volf is Yale Centre for Faith and Culture, the Centre for Global Gesellschaft in Freiburg in Switzerland, and others as well. So those are the three broad strands of what we'll be focusing on. Is that the last slide? Is there any more after that? Yeah, okay. So that's, I mean, you don't have to pay too much attention to that. I want to focus on the kind of broader questions. But this is, again, we were able to raise a bit of money for this, and we've got enough to get started. We've got a team of 4 of us working based in Lambeth Palace. I've got a senior editor, a guy who used to work at Number 10 under David Cameron, who was head of digital communications there. Been in charge of comms at HS2 for the last 5 years, and knows a bit about how to get unpopular messages out to people who don't want to hear it. Really good guy, you know, and he's drafting the website. He'll be the main editorial voice, filter on that. A number of other really good people working for that as well. So this is something we're just going to give it a go. We may get it right, we may not. It's one of those things when you've got to pull up the sails and you hope and pray that it catches the wind of the Spirit and it'll fly. I have no idea whether it will or not, but I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a number of years and see if we can make something happen and stir something around the churches. And this is trying to get as many people as possible who've got those kind of gifts and that passion to be involved in this vision. So, what I want to do now, we've got about maybe about 20 minutes for discussion and 20 minutes for questions at the end. And again, if you can just turn around in your where you're sitting to maybe groups of 3 or 4 or 5 maybe. And here are some questions that you might want to work with. What are the best examples of public witness that you've seen? A witness that goes beyond the local towards public witness. What are the best examples of public witness you've seen? Can you give us some examples of that? In what ways have you been able to use your voice in public to commend Christian faith? Maybe you've got some examples of times when you, as a minister, as a person with certainly with local standing, have been able to use your voice in public. And 3, what would you find helpful to develop your public voice? In what way would you like to kind of grow in this area of the church's public witness? And then lastly, which is a very selfish one for me to ask really, but I would love to pick your brains. What would your advice be to me and to our team as we set out on this Centre for Cultural Witness? You're a really important part of the church in London, in the UK, and I would love to get your wisdom as we set out on this journey as we go. So, can I give us 20 minutes until about 10 past, then we'll gather together for about 20 minutes of Q&A and discussion all together. So turn to others and chew away at those for 20 minutes, then we'll come together.